Welcome to The Breadwinners, a podcast where we explore how people build meaningful work and financial stability under real-world pressures. Breadwinning isn't just about ambition, it's about timing. When your earning years collide with your most expensive years, and the margin for error disappears. I'm your host, Rachael Lowell, and I'm thrilled to have award-winning writer and author Susan Dominus with us today. Susan is a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine and a lecturer at Yale University. She's written many articles that have likely pinged around your group chat, including her groundbreaking feature on menopause care, which won the National Magazine Award and was the most gift-shared New York Times article of 2023. She was also part of the Times team that won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. And she is the author of The Family Dynamic, A Journey into the Mystery of Sibling Success, published in 2025 and featured on numerous Best of the Year lists. What I've always admired about Susan's work is her ability to help us understand and explore power, success, and systems, while also being deeply honest about the personal stakes behind them. I can't wait to share her wisdom with you. Let's dive in. Susan, so thrilled to have you with us on The Breadwinners.
It's a delight to be here.
As you know, this podcast is about getting to the core of what it means to win the bread in this day and age. Not the myths, not the stories we've been told, but what it actually means to grow up and build a life of working and earning and living. You have so much to say about this. I can't wait to dive in.
Yeah. It's a subject that I wish people spoke more openly about more often in general, so I'm really glad this podcast exists.
So let's start with your personal story, Susan. What messages did you grow up with around winning bread, around having a life outside of winning bread?
So both of my parents, especially my mom grew up extremely poor on the Lower East Side way before that was a cool thing at all. Like I've had, other people who grew up on the Lower East Side, even like Blanche, when they, learned exactly what block my mom was on. I mean, she definitely had a pretty low income childhood. And my grandmother was, basically a housekeeper and then worked in a factory. And my grandfather, as my cousin would say, he wasn't the contractor. He was the guy who, is one of 10 guys you call to paint the house. They were very working class people, basically. So my mother raised me in an atmosphere of real financial anxiety. I grew up in an upper middle class home, I would say, in Westchester County. But I grew up drinking powdered milk because it was cheaper. And we always went down to the Lower East Side to buy clothing. When we did buy clothing, we also mostly wore hand-me-downs. So it was a very strange situation because I was living in Westchester County in the 80s, and my community was very affluent, and our home was quite nice. But there was still this sense of real frugality, and a lot of the choices my parents have made have been about avoiding risk. And I think the reason I was interested in writing a book that I did write about high-achieving families was I was interested in the kinds of families where, you hear about these families where the parents are like, you can do anything you set your heart to and dream big and, we believe in you. And my parents definitely believed in me, but the message I definitely got was, just as easy to fall in love with a rich guy as a poor one. And also the primary goal is financial security. It's not to achieve your dreams. It's not to change the world. It's not to give back to the world, frankly. It was get yourself into a very stable financial situation. So I do think that I have a lot of lingering, I think it's almost as if you've been raised by a mom who diets, and then when you get to be an adult, you have a little bit of a binging problem. Like I both have a lot of anxiety about money, but I also am not so great about saving it. So really healthy combination, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So for my family, it was kind of a big deal that I didn't go into law or medicine or advertising, which is what my dad and my sister did. My brother's a lawyer, very stable career path. There's a track. When I was an editorial assistant working at Glamour, my parents were like, we don't get it. What's the track? And will you ever make money? And they weren't trying to talk me out of it, but my mom kept trying me to get to this family friend of ours who was doing really well in pharmaceutical PR because that was really stable work and it paid very well. And they were like, oh, PR, that's writing, which it is. But all of this is to say, I was sort of swimming against the tide a little bit. And I think that to this day, I've wondered what choices I would have made that were different had I grown up in a kind of artsier, more freewheeling family that was, some people who grow up poor, it can be really liberating because they're like, I know how to be poor. It wasn't so bad. I got out of it. For my mom, it was like, I don't want to go back. And I don't want you to go back. And I don't want you to experience what I experienced. So anyway, they were people who were worried about financial security. They were also people who really worshiped the New York Times. I always say that we had not one, but two subscriptions to the Times so that my dad could take one on the train and my mom could read one over coffee in the morning. So I think when I ended up at the Times, that was a turning point for them, maybe. But anyway, I had a very sui generis kind of experience in my own family in that it was not a family that had writers or academics or creative types in it that I knew of. Later, I got in touch with the whole side of the family we'd been out of touch with for a long time and found one of the long lost kind of remote cousins was a PhD in education who taught journalism. And that was really exciting for me. And now I'm very happy to report that my nephew is trying to be a screenwriter and my niece is interning at CNN right now. Like, this is very not Dominus of previous generation kinds of things to do.
Yeah. Wow. I think two things come up for me, two Croutons, as we'll call them. One, where's the track? I feel like it's such a common, that's something that I grew up with too. I don't know if that's, where the sort of economic and cultural backgrounds. We're both Jewish women. We would give my parents some relief to know that there was a track. The track was always so important. You were referencing the binge, going from really healthy food to a binge, kind of going against what you had grown up with, not to an extreme, but sort of with some subconscious intention. Like, I'm going to do this my way. Is that how you would describe it with going into writing?
Oh, with going into writing, it was just, I'm a little bit of that classic person who really wasn't going to be very good at anything else anyway. And that was the thing I had most consistently gotten good feedback about and that I liked to do. So I think I chose that path just because it was natural for me. And also, to be honest, I didn't start out as a writer because that was crazy pants. Like, to be a writer, you might as well say you want to be like an astrologer or something. I started out as an editor because that at least had a little bit of a track. And I honestly was an editor, even though, I think I was a competent editor. I got very good feedback from my writers, but I didn't really love it. And I was very envious of the writers I was editing. And I did that, as I said, because it was stable compared to writing.
Sure.
And then I turned 30 and I met my husband, who grew up in a family that really did value the arts and was not at all materialistic and lived very, very simply in Syracuse, New York. And my husband is, like, in his own way, a true artist. And he really encouraged me to make the leap and leave editing behind and start doing what I wanted to do, which was write. So if I hadn't met my husband, I honestly think I would have ended up still editing all these years later.
Yeah. I want to hear that partnership, how that enabled you to make the leap into writing. But before, in your book, you're talking about how families and family systems impact our choices and our achievements in life. What's so interesting to me is the way that you talk about how siblings impact those decisions, which isn't something that I'd given a ton of thought about, no matter how many times on previous episodes of this podcast I've mentioned my little brother and his choices around work and life. It's really not something that I thought about a lot. And your brother encouraged you to take that first step into editing. You shared a story where he came home from college and he said, would you think about taking this role in the high school?
I'll tell you what happened with my brother. By the way, I don't think my brother was thinking about it as a career so much for me. I was like maybe I was in 10th grade and he came home from college and I said, why aren't you working on the school newspaper? Because he knew I liked to write.
Right.
And I had told him there was none. It had become defunct since he was there. He's 6 years older. And he sort of stood in the doorway and basically bullied me and shamed me into, how could you be so apathetic as to let democracy die without a pre-press at your high school, that kind of thing. And I guess he got me excited enough about it that I actually did start doing it. And I do think that siblings see each other more clearly and dispassionately than maybe parents do. And I also think that young people, adolescents in particular, are often more likely to take advice from a sibling, maybe even a sibling they're not that close to, or with whom they have a rivalry, than a parent. Because your siblings, there's research that says that young people, adolescents, they want to get advice from people who understand them and who also understand the world that they're living in. And when kids say to their parents, you just don't understand, it's true, they really just don't understand what the dynamics are at a high school at the granular level that a sibling can. So I think if my parents had suggested to me, why don't you go work at the high school newspaper, I would have said, you don't understand. There isn't one and no one's going to listen to me and I don't have the time. But something about my brother who really, by the way, I don't think my parents necessarily were like, knew me in that way anyway, that they would have said, you should be a reporter, Susie, you know, but my brother just could put it all together in a different way. So I think siblings can also really be important social capital. And you see that in this book I wrote, The Family Dynamic, in the Murguia family in particular. They grew up in a very low-income Mexican-American family in Kansas City, Kansas. But they were certainly the four youngest ones were clearly very, very bright. And they all went to law school. And even though they took different paths out of law school, they offered each other tremendous social capital in the other connections that they had made in high-power worlds. So a lot of what happened in their lives wouldn't have happened with each other.
That's fascinating to hear about. So let's move forward to your transition to writing, because you had this wonderfully supportive partner who was saying, go for it. Just give us a sense of what the transition to writing was like for you and what you felt you wanted to write about initially.
So it's easier in some ways to answer the first question than the second one, because I write about anything. That's the joy of being a magazine writer. I tend to write about women, and I tend to be really interested in humanizing people whom people don't think they can connect to. But I guess, so this weird thing happened that doesn't really happen to many people, which is I'd worked at a bunch of magazines as an editor, and I had actually written one or two pieces freelance while I was still editing. And when I decided I wanted to be a writer, I started out with a very generous contract from both Glamour magazine and New York magazine, because I'd been an editor there and they knew that I could write extremely quickly. They knew I was basically a responsible person. And I think that those assumptions panned out very quickly. And I had done freelance for Glamour for quite a while, so they knew they could trust even though I was an editor, I was doing a little bit of writing on the side. New York Magazine, Caroline Miller, God bless her, hired me to be a staff writer. Really, I'd only written one cover story for anything, which was for the Times Magazine about, it was an early story about children and allergies. But that really made it possible for me to work for myself and supplement that income. You know, back then there were so many magazines that, you know, the example I always give was like Hallmark magazine would call me and say, do you want to write a piece about like your least favorite body part? And whatever they offered me, I would ask for $500 more. Nobody ever said no. What's $500? You know, so I was making much, much better money as a freelancer at that time than I did when I was an editor. But I also have to tell you, I made more money as a freelancer than I did as a staff employee of the New York Times, which I became later, for many, many years.
So walk us through. So you start out with this tremendous trust from these two different publications, and you're off to the races. Or tell us a little bit about when you dove in with those two partnerships, and then 5 years later, how had you become wiser, you know, more experienced in your writing career?
That is a great question. So amazingly, even though I was on staff at New York Magazine and at Glamour, I was also able to freelance for the New York Times Magazine, where my dear friend Ariel Kamener regularly gave me incredibly exciting and challenging assignments. You know, my first week as a freelancer, I remember I was like, so basically I left my editing job. I'd been working at Nerve as an editor. I actually got laid off. They were sort of running out of money at that point. And my husband had convinced me to take the opportunity of this layoff to like switch to being a writer. So we went to Nova Scotia for a month. We had this incredible, dreamy month together. And I couldn't wait to get back to New York. I had these contracts lined up. And my first week of work, I was working on my first assignment for the Times Magazine, which was about basically celebrity divorce lawyers, I think. And my first week of work, I was walking by a store that sold TVs and saw that the World Trade Center had been hit. So that was my first week of work at New York Magazine. Wow. So you sort of get thrown into the deep end very, very quickly when your professional life as a writer starts the week of 9/11 and you're a staff writer at New York Magazine. And I have to say it came very, very naturally to me. So it wasn't a huge steep learning curve, I think, because I had been doing so much rewriting and editing as an editor. I've been an avid magazine reader since I was, a 7-year-old or 9-year-old kid in a house full of Life and Time and Newsweek and New York and The Atlantic and Harper's. And for my 16th birthday, my mom's best friend gave me a subscription to Granta magazine, if you even remember that. And we had Harper's. I don't know. I just think it was very deep in me. And my editor, Ariel, really threw very ambitious stories at me. I mean, I was, I think, just engaged to my husband at around 30. How old was I? Maybe 32. And she asked me if I would go to Afghanistan to report on young girls who were going to school for the first time. I was quite nervous about that. That was a really new experience for me, if I'm totally honest. And
Sure.
I think a huge amount of growth came from that. My husband and I were also living in France for 7 months of some of my first years of freelancing. And that allowed me to explore other kinds of reporting I never would have been able to do back in New York. And it was really wonderful. It's interesting when you talk about the growth. I think I did maybe have 5 solid years of wonderful freelancing and a dream career. And then it all fell apart. So basically, I used to be able to write profiles for this British magazine called Stella that I think was an insert in The Guardian. And if I'm not mistaken, they would pay me like $6,000. That was when I first started freelancing. And they were really fun. They asked very little of me. I got to, interview Joan Rivers for them and the podiatrist to the stars in New York. They had me on the kind of like wacky New York women beat. And those were painless and fun and really good money. And I would say by the time if I started freelancing when I was around 30, by the time I was 35 or 36, they were offering me $600 for those same kinds of stories. The advertising market was falling apart. Readership was falling apart. Hallmark magazines of the world were starting to fold. Just revenue was plummeting. And I started getting really scared because my husband and I were both, I think, at that point, freelance. And I realized I needed a job. My husband, I always thought would be the one who stayed home with the kids. And I always used to say, the worst thing that happens is I'll get a job as the executive editor of Teen Vogue. You don't realize that, first of all, Teen Vogue has thrived, but other magazines where I thought I could walk into a job that was lucrative and stable, those were all folding. So all these things that I thought were my backup safety nets were falling apart. And I was lucky enough to be asked to send some sample ideas and columns to the New York Times, which was trying to hire a new Metro columnist. At the time, Metro columnists wrote twice a week. So I was used to writing 8,000, 10,000 word stories. Here I was considering writing twice a week. At this point, by the way, I should say, very importantly, I have twins who are under 3 years old. Oh. And I really, really thought hard about it. And it was very scary, but thank God I was offered the job and I took the job because I've been at the Times ever since. And obviously it is a privilege to work there. So those first years with twins under 3, writing a column twice a week nearly broke me, And I'm not going to lie, when I look back and think about it, there aren't that many regrets I have in my life. And the fact that I was writing the column made it possible for me to have the career I have now at the New York Times, and I learned so much. I do think having those kinds of constant deadlines and kids that young, for me, it wasn't ideal. I was always either thinking about my next story or worrying about a mistake in the story that ran, or there was a lot of not being present for the kids, if I'm totally honest. There was flexibility, so that was nice. Sometimes my column was in for the day and I could go to the Mommy and Me class, and that was awesome. But there were also times when I was just with them and not with them because I was thinking about something else. A lot of times like that.
To think about what you must have been feeling as a mom with tiny kids in something you've written about a lot, sort of the pressures that we experience around motherhood and balancing, or I don't like that word, integrating work and life. And you grew up with these messages that we were talking about earlier around like, what's the track, right? And you were in an industry that had kind of, reorgs that had restructured in certain ways. And so that's a lot of different pressure points weighing on you at the same time. Here's another crouton I always reference. Gail Sheehy's Passages, the Deadline Decade, where she talks about that sort of age where you're trying to raise kids, you're trying to be at the top of your career, get to where you want to go and bring in the income, and it's all hitting at once. So that must have been excruciating for you.
It was a hard time. I'm not going to lie. I mean, just having twins alone who are under 3 is like so much fun. I've never laughed so hard in my life, but also just it's unrelenting. It can be very hard on a marriage. And I think that my husband and I, the good news is for my husband, I think, is that one of the things I wanted to say about my mom, in addition to everything else she always said, was she always said, you have to be able to earn a living no matter what, in case you want to walk away.
Yeah.
I never wanted to walk away, but the idea that, of course, I would be responsible for helping support the family, that was very deep in me. And I really never understand those relationships when there's a woman who likes her job perfectly fine and is making lots of money, but resents her partner because he's not making more money. Like, I never understood. I think that I'm, like Free to Be You and Me got deep enough into me that I don't totally understand that. I don't think that like men just for the sake of breadwinning have to be breadwinners, But yeah. I don't know that I would have taken a job writing a column twice a week with my kids that young had there not been some financial pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that as somebody who's on post-marriage life, I've talked to a lot of people who've had those kind of resentments. And I think part of it is the income and part of it is the help around the domestic support, right? So they're mixed together, but they're very, very distinct pressures. But so let's skip ahead to, you have built this phenomenal career. As our producer said, you're a GOAT, right? Like you have written books, you've been balancing your own independent path as a successful writer with a role inside one of the most prominent publications in the world. Like, tell us how you got to that.
Oh, I mean, basically, I had the good fortune. Like I sometimes tell my students this story. I've been writing the column. I really missed magazine writing. I was at a party. Jill Abramson, then editor of the New York Times, was there. And I said to Frank Bruni, who was sitting next to me at a party, yeah, I'd rather be working for the magazine. And he said, go talk to Jill about it. And I was like, it's a party. I'm not going to go up to Jill now. And he said, yes, you are. And he literally pushed me.
Yeah.
And I said to her, how are you? How are things? Things are great. I'm feeling like maybe I did my best work at the magazine when I was a freelancer for the magazine. And she said, I agree. And the next thing I knew, I was moving to the magazine, which was hugely gratifying. And I really would say that I like to think that I'm good to work with and I turn things in on time and I know what I'm doing. But also, once you get to the New York Times Magazine, you're held up and you're supported by some of the best and most incredible and most likable editors in the world, and fact checkers and photography editors, greats like Kathy Ryan and Jessica Dimson. So I love the New York Times Magazine. I really do. I've been lucky enough to work with people like Jerry Maserati and Lauren Kern and Hugo Lindgren, and now the very beloved Jake Silverstein, who's a total vision guy. So I have to say, although I like to think I do good work, I also really do have the benefit of the ideas and expertise coming from the people who surround me.
I mean, there's no question that you work with some superstars. But what I love about that story with Frank Bruni is he pushed you to do something that I think people are so reluctant to do, but we could see so much growth and success when people are able to say, this is what I think I'm good at. This is where my sweet spot is. This is what I'd like to do, right? And I can do better for this organization, this publication, if I focus on bringing my best work as it aligns with kind of what we're trying to do here. So I love that he pushed you to say that, because it's not an easy thing to say to a person like that. So that's wonderful.
I'm very grateful.
It's amazing. So I want to switch over. Let's dive into the carbo load section, where we ask some sort of rapid fire questions just to get to the heart of what you're experiencing with breadwinning right now. So what was one thing that you wish you had learned about breadwinning earlier in your life?
About breadwinning or about money in general?
Well, I mean, money in general, but making it, keeping it, growing it, you know what I mean?
I mean, here's something stupid. I really didn't understand how a mortgage worked until I was in my 20s. And so I think I thought, like, why even bother trying to save money? I'll never have $500,000, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so something as simple as that, I just can't believe nobody explained that to me. I mean, I really was like well into my 20s before I understood how a mortgage worked. And so I can tell you that from the time my kids could count, I was trying to explain that concept to them. I think also probably you hear this a lot on your show. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to ask. It helps to get a counter offer in order to get a raise. It's very rare that people get big raises because they just are being recognized for how fabulous they are, you know? And people feel uncomfortable doing that, I think, because they are loyal to their employer, but it's the best way to make a difference in your income. That's the biggest way that you make a big jump. Sometimes on the one hand, you know, if you want to stay, sometimes it does take getting a competing offer. I mean, that's never been why I've sought over my many years of my career. I think it would be manipulative to try to get a job just so you could make a counteroffer, but it is how it tends to pan out. I guess the other thing I would say is that sometimes you have to leave anyway to be taken seriously. I really loved working at Glamour magazine. I love my colleagues there. But I started there when I was 22 years old. And like on my first week of the job, I made a million dumb mistakes. And I think those really stay with you. It's hard for people to move on from that. So I think it is important to move around a little bit. You have to move around for your salary. You have to move around for your maturity. You have to move around so that you can reinvent yourself. I also think it's worth staying someplace if you like your workplace and you love your colleagues and you admire your boss. That is rare. Yeah. And there is capital in that too. So I don't chase every dollar. I also value my mental health, because if you don't have a good work environment, you don't feel respected, you don't feel supported, then, you know, what's it all for, really? You know, my very first job out of college was at Glamour magazine, and Laurel Toby wrote a column called Job Strategies, and I edited it. And I will never forget the advice from one of these organizational psychologists in one of those articles who was saying, no amount of money is worth your mental health. If you're in a toxic work environment, get out under any circumstances. Yeah. And so that stayed with me too. And that all relates to breadwinning.
Sure. I talk about that a lot. I think a lot of people are navigating a workplace toxicity at the moment. There's so many different things going on. It's hard for that not to weigh on us. And self-regulation is one of the areas I talk about a lot in my work, where there's been a lot of research on this can be damaging for our mental health, but how do we show up and learn to kind of get regulated for ourselves as leaders and with folks that we're working with? But I want to ask you two more questions before we wrap today. I want to know what you're excited to tackle next. You've just written this amazing book. You're constantly writing about new topics. Is there a glimmer in Susan's eye for the next kind of topic that you want to dive into deeply?
You know, it's funny. This is actually related to breadwinning also, right? There's some famous line like only a fool ever wrote, but for money, you know? And I have to say, now that I'm an empty nester now, although there has to be a better term than that, an open windower, I don't know. One of the things that I am actually excited about is the idea that right now I have the time and space to finally do things that aren't specifically to keep my family afloat or pay the mortgage or, I mean, obviously most journalists who are journalists do the work, not for the money. Like, we do it because we feel passionately about the issues that we're covering and that we want to shed light on. But it's also a living, and ideally, if you're lucky enough. But right now, I'm interested in doing the kind of writing I've wanted to do my whole life, which is a little bit more fiction. And I'm exploring that and loving it. And it may never see the light of day, and I may never make a dime for it. So in a way, one of the pleasures, you know, I'm 55 years old, right? My big goal in life as a breadwinner was to be able to raise my kids in the same house until they left. My big fear, as somebody who's anxious about money, what if we can't afford the mortgage and we have to pick up and move in the middle of their 11th grade? You know, that kind of thing. Yeah. My kids are out. In the worst case scenario, we'd have to sell the house, we'd move to Yonkers. I don't know what we would do. It'd be fine. So I feel sort of liberated to think about things beyond breadwinning in a way at this very moment. I would like to stay in my house forever. You know, that's the best case scenario. I don't think I'm as driven by the fear of disrupting my kids' lives. Like, all those things, I feel a little bit liberated, and that feels like a relief.
Yeah. While you were writing this last book, did you have a taste of that liberation? Like, did you feel like that book was very much kind of a labor of breadwinning? Or did you feel like you were starting to get a glimpse of like, oh, when I have more freedom and flexibility to do with the empty nest, open window life, that I will, hopefully have more of this experience?
Okay, I'm going to be totally honest here. I was extremely busy not this past year, but the year before it. I was finishing my book. I teach at Yale, and I was writing full time at the magazine. And a friend of mine said, "You take on too much. Why do you take on too much?" And I said, "It's partly the money. It's not easy to put 2 kids through college and have a house in the suburbs of New York City. I'm trying to keep our head like slightly above water, So the book was part of that. In other words, it was a joy to write it, but it was also something that I knew there was a financial component to it. I don't know that I would have done it for no advance or a very small advance. For me to make the sacrifices it required, I needed to know that there would be something that came out on the other end of it that would make our lives easier. Yeah. So I would love to write another book, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I just know I'll have more space in my life. And so the money work trade-off doesn't have to be the ratio can be different, if that makes sense.
That makes a ton of sense. I appreciate that. That's really wonderful clarification. One last question for you, Susan, that we've asked our guests. When we look at this work-life equation and we're thinking about how AI is going to come in and impact, the experience of working and living today, I'm curious to ask my guests, what do you think will always stay human about the way that we work?
I think that if I were to write something and ask AI for feedback already, and I don't, but if I were, based on other interactions I've had with AI, already the feedback would be nuanced, interesting, and enlightening. I have no doubt about it. It would make my work better. Not that I do it, but if I did.
Right.
However, I just went for a walk this morning with a dear friend who's a writer, and I will also always want to commune with other writers or other readers about my work, because AI may be useful to me, but I don't care about the AI. And so the people I want to reach and with whom I want to commune and connect and inspire and be inspired by, those are always going to be humans. And that's so much of why I write. And so AI might help me become a better writer, but it won't help me build better relationships with other people. I mean, it might even help me build better relationships with other people by making me a better writer. But I want the feedback as well from a human to see how it makes a human feel. So I think that will always be true.
I love that. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today, and can't wait to put this out there.
Thanks. I really admire you for doing this particular topic because, as I said, I really wish people spoke more openly about money, and I'm always so grateful when people are open about their own experience.
This has been the Breadwinners podcast. I'm your host, Rachael Lowell. The show is produced by Rachael Lowell and Rachel Sklar. Technical production by Ron Pissarro. Music by Hannah Baki. With gratitude for support from Ruth Ann Harnisch. The Breadwinners was founded in 2019 by me and Jennifer Owens. The Breadwinners is a co-production between Smart Friends Network and Reworking Leadership. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.